They thought they could scare one man out of his own home. What they didn't know was that 6 Navy SEALs were about to turn the tables in a way no one on that street would ever forget. Calvin Dunmore had just settled into his favorite chair with a cup of hot tea, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan filling the room, when a thunderous knock echoed through his front door. It wasn't the polite kind of knock neighbors used. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind meant to rattle nerves. Cautiously, he opened the door and found 2 men standing on his porch. They wore black tactical vests, radios clipped to their shoulders, and mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes even though the sun was already setting. One of them stepped forward with an intimidating scowl and said, "We're HOA Enforcement. You've got 48 hours to vacate this property." He flashed what looked like a badge, but to Calvin it seemed oddly shiny, more like plastic than metal. The second man shoved a sealed envelope into Calvin's hand, his voice low and threatening. "Failure to comply will result in forced removal." Calvin's heart pounded as the weight of the words sank in. Vacate? Forced removal? This was the house he had worked overtime shifts for. The house where his mother had visited every Sunday before she passed. The house he'd promised himself he would never lose. He glanced down at the envelope, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. For a moment he felt the cold grip of fear, but just as quickly his instincts kicked in. Something about these men didn't add up. Their vests bore no official insignia. Their SUV parked at the curb had no markings, and their language was too blunt, too careless to be lawful. Still, their confidence was frightening. Without another word, the 2 men turned and walked away, leaving Calvin standing in his doorway, staring at the envelope, his mind racing with disbelief and anger as the shadows of evening closed in around him. Calvin shut the door behind him and walked slowly to the kitchen table. The sealed envelope gripped tightly in his hand as if it might burn him. With a deep breath, he tore it open and unfolded the so-called eviction notice, spreading the papers across the wooden surface where he had eaten countless family dinners. His eyes scanned the words quickly, then more carefully, and a frown carved into his face. The letterhead was crooked, the formatting sloppy, and entire sentences were written with mistakes no real legal office would make. His name was misspelled in bold print at the top, and the HOA president's signature looked like it had been scribbled by a child, imitating an adult. Still, the threats leapt. Off the page, phrases like mandatory vacation of premises and subject to immediate seizure made his stomach twist. Calvin remembered his father's old advice: paperwork can trick a man if he doesn't know how to read it, but the truth never hides for long. He set the papers down and shook his head. This wasn't law, it was intimidation dressed up in cheap ink and fear. He reached for his phone and dialed the local police station, explaining what had happened. But the dispatcher's tone was detached, promising to send someone out when available. The words offered no comfort. Alone in the silence of his kitchen, Calvin's anger grew hotter. He had paid every bill, followed every rule, and fought too hard in life to let a pair of frauds bully him out of his own home. Just then, a thought flickered in his mind that changed the air in the room. Tonight wasn't just any night. His brothers, the men he had served with, trusted with his life, were on their way. 6 Navy SEALs, hardened by years of loyalty and courage, would soon be walking through his door. The low rumble of engines cut through the night, air as headlights swept across Calvin's driveway, scattering the unease that had settled inside him. He rose from his chair and stepped onto the porch, just in time to see 2 trucks and an SUV pulling up, their doors swinging open almost in unison. Out stepped men he hadn't seen in years, yet they looked as familiar as yesterday: broad shoulders, steady eyes, and the kind of calm strength that never fades from those who have walked through fire together. Marcus, the oldest among them, walked up first, his laugh echoing as he pulled Calvin into a crushing hug before his expression shifted to something more serious. One by one, the others followed: Jerome, thick-armed and quick-witted; Ellis, sharp-eyed and observant; Darnell, whose quiet presence always carried weight; Victor, still grinning like he had in the service; and Luis, the youngest, with the restless energy of a man who couldn't sit still for long. Calvin welcomed them inside, the warmth of reunion filling the house for a fleeting moment, before he laid the papers on the table. The room fell silent as they read, their expressions tightening with every line. Marcus tapped the page with one finger, his voice low but firm. "This isn't law. It's a scam. They're trying to run you out." The men exchanged knowing looks, their bond unspoken but clear. No one needed to ask if they would stand by Calvin. It was already decided. "Not tonight," Marcus said, his jaw set. The others nodded in agreement. Their presence alone enough to shift the balance of fear in the room. For the first time since the knock on his door, Calvin felt his chest loosen. He wasn't standing alone anymore. His brothers were here, and together they would face whatever came next. It was just past 9 when the deep growl of an engine rolled slowly down the street. The same black SUV that had pulled up earlier creeping back into view, its headlights slicing through the dark. Calvin and his 6 brothers-in-arms stood quietly in the living room, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. The SUV stopped at the curb, and out stepped the 2 men in tactical vests, their swagger thicker this time, as if they believed the fear they'd planted earlier had already done its work. One of them smirked as he strutted up the driveway, calling out, "We told you! 48 hours! You don't want to make this harder on yourself." But when the door swung open, their smirks faltered. Instead of one man standing alone, they were met with the sight of 7, Calvin at the center, flanked by 6 former Navy SEALs whose calm, unshakable presence filled the doorway like a wall. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Neighbors, already curious from the SUV's arrival, began peeking through blinds, and soon porch lights flicked on one by one, cameras and phones rising into view. Marcus stepped forward, towering over the nearest imposter, his voice low but thunderous. "You've got 30 seconds to tell us who you really are before this whole street and the police see exactly what you're doing here." The men's bravado cracked. One shifted nervously. The other stammered something about official orders, but the SEALs pressed closer, their eyes unblinking, their voices firm and unrelenting. The neighborhood was now fully awake, whispers and gasps spreading as the confrontation thickened. For the first time that night, the so-called enforcers looked trapped, caught in a spotlight brighter than any badge they had tried to flash. The tension on the street snapped when the distant wail of sirens grew louder, blue and red lights flickering against the houses as police cruisers sped into the cul-de-sac. The 2 imposters froze, their earlier confidence gone, their eyes darting for an escape, but Calvin's brothers had already moved with quiet precision, parking their trucks in a way that boxed the SUV in, cutting off any chance of retreat. Neighbors stepped further into their yards, phones lifted high, recording every second as the officers jumped out and demanded identification. Within moments, the fake badges were inspected, the paperwork examined, and the truth spilled out for everyone to see. It was all a fraud, a scam designed to scare hard-working homeowners out of their properties. The officers wasted no time. Handcuffs clicked shut, and the 2 men were led to the back of the cruiser, their heads lowered under the weight of shame. A ripple of relief and applause swept through the crowd as neighbors clapped, some even cheering Calvin's name. For him, the fear that had gripped his chest only hours earlier melted into something stronger, gratitude and pride. He turned to his friends, his voice breaking slightly as he said, "I thought I'd have to face this alone." Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his words steady and certain. "You'll never stand alone, not while we're here." The men exchanged a look that spoke of years of brotherhood, of battles fought side by side, and now of a bond that had once again protected one of their own. As the police drove away with the imposters in custody, Calvin looked at his home, his street, and the faces of the neighbors who had stood witness. That night he didn't just keep his house, he reclaimed his peace, his dignity, and his place in a community that would never forget the courage it had seen.